Shalom Aleichem, my dear brothers and sisters. In this video, I would like to discuss with you an ancient Jewish Midrash which talks about how Abraham, peace be upon him, had a conversation with King Nimrod. At first glance, this Midrash seems to be just like a cute little story, interesting story. However, if you think hard about what the Midrash is conveying, you will understand that our ancient ancestors tried to convey a deep philosophical message that helps us understand monotheism, the logic behind monotheism. So the story goes that when Abraham was young and he came to the conclusion that there is one God, he was brought to this king Nimrod, who was a local king at that time. And Nimrod said to him, "I worship fire, so let's worship fire together." So Abraham says, if that's the case, maybe we should worship water, because water can extinguish fire. So Nimrod replied, okay, let's worship water. Abraham says, no, maybe we should then worship the clouds, because the clouds bring water, they produce water. So Nimrod says, okay, let's worship the clouds. Then Abraham replies, if that's the case, maybe we should worship the wind, which carries, scatters the clouds. So Nimrod says, okay, let's worship the wind. And Abraham said, if that's the case, maybe we should worship the human, because the human can withstand the wind. At this point, Nimrod said, you're just playing with words. I worship fire, and I'm going to throw you into fire, and we'll see how your God saves you from that fire. And the story goes, the Midrash says that Nimrod threw Abraham into the fire, and God created a miracle that Abraham was untouched by that fire. So now this is the story. So the question is, what does this story convey? And I'll tell you why. What? This story tells us the logic behind monotheism. And the logic is that if you look into this, all throughout this physical world, this physical universe, you will notice one thing, that there is no one physical force that controls all the other forces. They are all interdependent with each other. So for example, we have, let's say, fire, right? Fire is, I can see why in the ancient times they thought that this might be God, because it's really powerful force in a way. It can burn a lot of stuff, pretty much almost anything, right? But the thing is, we see that fire has its limitations. It cannot burn water, it cannot, burn rock. There's limit to what fire cannot burn light, for example, right? So there's a limit to what fire can do. We see water. Water can extinguish fire. However, water also has limitations, right? Water can freeze into solid when it's too cold. It can evaporate if it's, too hot. We see solid has a limitation. Solid, it's solid, but it cannot, let's say, turn liquid into solid. In the old primitive scientific observance, these things were like, what people would look after and try to figure out, what's in charge of this world. And therefore, Abraham was the one who came to the conclusion that we see that all these forces are actually interdependent. And that means that there has to be some other force above that controls the limitations of these forces. And in fact, that's what the Hebrew word for God, one of the names of God in Hebrew is, I'm going to pronounce it just because I'm teaching it. We like not to pronounce God's name in vain, but I'm going to pronounce it because this is for the sake of teaching. So one of God's name is El Shaddai. In Hebrew, the word dai means enough, something enough. Shaddai means the one that made enough, or that made limitations. And this is actually the name of God, which means that God of limits, the God that makes limits. God is the one that provides creates limits for all the other forces that are below him. Now, one can try to, I was actually having this discussion with my friend, and he says, what if these forces are controlled by something else, something like abstract, something like love, or something like that. So in that case, if you want to try to say this, then what you still end up saying is that maybe that then this one love, whatever you want to call it, if that's the force that controls all other forces, then maybe that love is the God. It doesn't matter what you call this, but the conclusion is that there has to be one force, because as soon as you have more than one, you have two, and these two cannot overtake one another. That means there's somebody above, or someone above, who makes sure that these two forces are in sync and they cannot overpower each other. So it's only logical to conclude that there has to be only one force above them all that establishes these limits and does not allow any of these one forces overtake another. And in fact, it's interesting that science is trying to do the same thing. This shows you just that this is a very logical thing to do. Science knows right now that there are four main forces in the universe that control pretty much everything. Matter, control light, whatever it might be, gravity. So the four forces known to the science today are gravity, electromagnetism, nuclear weak force, and nuclear strong force. This is what's known, because through observance, we see gravity works, right? We see magnets pulling towards each other. So what force is that? That's not gravity, because it's, they don't necessarily fall towards the earth, but they pull towards each other. So the scientists called it electromagnetism, because it's the same force that an electric field attaches to the magnet field. It's the same field, so it's called electromagnetism. Then there's the nuclear force. The nuclear weak force is the electrons going around the nucleus of an atom. It's not gravity, because the electron doesn't fall to the ground, right? So it's got to be some other third force that pulls the electron towards the nucleus of the atom. And then there's the nuclear strong force, which is inside the nucleus of the atom. There are the quarks, and they attach all to each other, and which is, it's not gravity, it's not magnet, it's not the nuclear weak force, so it's got to be fourth force. They called it the nuclear strong force. So anyway, so science knows these four forces. And what actually Einstein was trying to do for pretty much most of his life is to establish that there has to be one force that controls these four forces. Because, why? Because these four forces, since they all have their limits, then there has to be something above them that enforces these four forces to work. And that's actually what the modern string theory is trying to do. They're trying to establish, to say that all these four forces are actually being controlled by one force. Why? Because this is really the most logical thing to do. As soon as you have more than one and they have their limits, then there has to be someone above them. I'm saying someone because I believe it's God. Someone above them that controls these forces beneath. And the difference between what the scientists would say maybe is that instead of calling this someone, they would say something, meaning that it has no conscience. It's all powerful, it's everywhere, but the only difference is, like, why would scientists, for example, not say that this is God? Only one reason, because by definition, what the scientists are trying to prove, that this one force controls everything. In fact, they call it the theory of everything. They say that this one force that controls the four universal forces is actually controlling everything, the whole world. Now, why would they not call this God? For only one reason. And this is, I think, only one difference would be between a religious person and a scientist in this regard. And the difference would be that a religious person would say that this one force has conscience, meaning it has a will, it creates things as it wills. But a scientist would probably say that this one force has no conscience, it just controls everything without any consciousness. I think that's really so I'm sorry for making this video too scientific and maybe a little bit more complex than I wanted to do, but thank you for watching. If you have any questions, please feel free to comment. Thank you.